Our next speaker is the Accessibility and Publishing Standards Lead at Rakuten Kobo, where she leads the company-wide accessibility efforts and adoption of new technical standards. She's also the chair of the EPUB Working Group, chair of the Publishing Working Group, and editor of the audiobooks specification at W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. She will speak to us today about the accessible audiobook. Please welcome Wendy Reid.
Thank you for the amazing introduction. Let me just share my slides. Yes, thank you for having me today. Today I'm going to be speaking about audiobooks and accessibility and a little bit about the W3C audiobook standard. So I already got an amazing introduction. I'm also now the chair of the Audiobooks Working Group, which I will explain a little bit about later as well. In today's talk, I am going to cover a little bit about the history of audiobooks, how we define what an audiobook is, the comparison of audiobooks versus ebooks with audio, the W3C audiobook specification, and what the future is going to look like, at least for audiobooks. So audiobooks were invented back actually in the 19th century, but they were first put into wide use, or as wide as possible, in the 1930s. And they were specifically designed to be a format for blind and visually impaired veterans coming back from World War I. They were produced mainly by organizations like the Library of Congress and the Royal Society for the Blind. And it was a fairly limited library. It was based on a little bit of community feedback, but also just quite a bit of what was deemed appropriate for people with visual impairments. There's a lot of censorship and things like that. That lasted all the way up until the 70s, where when people started spending more time in their cars, they wanted a little bit more entertainment. And so companies started to see the market potential to bring audiobooks into the kind of more commercial mainstream market. And that's where we see the rise of a lot of the modern audiobook companies like Recorded Books. In the 1990s, a little company named Audible created the first digital audio player. I think it held about an hour's worth of audio, but it was the start of what we saw with things like the iPod, where everyone started carrying media players in their pocket. And now almost everyone today can, listen to an audiobook wherever they are and however they want. And this is where accessibility kind of comes back into focus for audiobooks. It was kind of lost in the 1970s and up until today. And now, as we explore more accessible media types, accessibility is now a new focus. In this next section, I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. I'm also not even European. So I'm a Canadian. So I'm not going to be able to give you any legal advice, but I am going to talk a little bit about the European Accessibility Act and its impact on audiobooks. So the first thing is the definition of audiobooks. Unfortunately, the European Accessibility Act framework doesn't explicitly mention audiobooks. It refers instead to ebooks in two different sections. One as an electronic computer coding that enables the circulation and consultation of a mostly textual and graphical intellectual work, which doesn't sound very much like an audiobook. But then also as a service consisting of the provision of digital files that convey the electronic version of a book. And that sounds a little bit more like an audiobook. Unfortunately, it's hard to interpret, and there's been understandably quite a bit of confusion. We presented on this at Frankfurt and got a lot of questions about it. And so I just want to say about this that while it's not explicitly mentioned in the European Accessibility Act, there is a possibility of it being mentioned in the individual countries' implementations of the Act. And so that is something to consider as a publisher. But the other thing to consider is that audiobooks are considered by customers to be part of the digital reading ecosystem. And so, and with the rise of audiobooks, it's such a huge and growing market. Why exclude users from the start by not making your audiobooks accessible? And I'm going to show you just how easy it might actually be. I also wanted to cover another question that we got, which is about the difference between an audiobook versus an ebook with audio. I consider them to be completely different products, and most retailers and distribution channels consider that as well. Audiobooks are primarily audio content, which may occasionally have text content. In my experience, I would say 90+% of all audiobooks in market today have no text related to them whatsoever. That is obviously changing, and I hope it does, but the current market state, there are very few audiobooks out there with text. For ebooks are primarily text content with optional image content, audio or video content. I think almost every ebook has an image associated with it, at least in the form of a cover, but very few ebooks actually have audio or video content. The formatting and structure of these documents are really different, and so are the way that they're produced. And when I say produced, I mean not only just the production of the book inside the publisher, taking a manuscript and turning it into an ebook, but those streams are also different in terms of audiobooks. A lot of audiobooks are produced by completely different companies and occasionally even completely different publishers. And so it's very important to consider these as separate entities and not to be too concerned about seeing crossover between the two formats. But here's the reason I'm really here. I want to talk about the W3C audiobook specification. As was already mentioned, the W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium. It is an international standards body that creates standards, or they call them recommendations, for the web. You will probably know them for things like HTML, CSS, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. The Publishing Working Group is a group within the W3C. It was chartered to create standards for publishing on the web. And just yesterday, we completed our final work on publication manifest and audiobooks. What this means is that they are both now official W3C recommendations, with all the weight that that holds. In the audiobook specification, or the recommendation, I should say, an audiobook is defined as a collection of audio resources grouped together by a reading order, metadata, and resources. The goal of the specification for us was to kind of bring order to the chaos of the audiobooks industry. Audiobooks digitally have been around for well over 20 years at this point, and yet there's still no single way to send an audiobook from a publisher to a user. And that's what we aim to fix. We were seeing things in market like folders, things being sent in folders, different file types, different metadata formats, no metadata formats. And so we wanted to kind of create a single way to send files through the supply chain in a way that everyone could expect to know what to expect and make it just a little bit easier for every step along the chain to be successful. The manifest provides a method for content creators, so be that the author or a publishing company, to send metadata, content, and resources in one single format. So when I say metadata, I specifically am talking about the metadata within the audiobooks format. In the format, the metadata is purely for identification purposes. So if you're thinking Onyx, this is separate. This is, your Onyx feeds or whatever retail metadata that you're using. This is different from that. I have a small example in this slide here. We use a language called JSON to form the manifest, but for metadata, we're basically just looking for identifying information. Is this an audiobook? How do you identify it? This could be a URL, this could be an ISBN, whatever identifying code that you might use, the name of the book, the author, its narrator. We use a language called Schema, or a framework called Schema, which actually makes the metadata portion incredibly flexible. So we can include things like accessibility metadata or different metadata types for different purposes, which makes it really flexible and really usable for whatever, type of publishing you're doing. The reading order is kind of the core of the specification. The most important feature. The reading order provides a definitive list of the order of the files in an audiobook, telling the user agent or the reading system that here's the order. You're going to be reading from chapter 1 to chapter 10. Here is the files and this is what you need to know about them. The reading order of an audiobook in the specification can only be made of audio resources, no other types of resource. The type of information that we'd be looking for, especially as a user agent, would be, where is this file located? And this can be either locally or through a URL. What type of file is it? Are you using MP3 or WAV or FLAC or anything like that? How long is this file, the duration, and what is it called? And there's many, as I mentioned before, we are all still using schema here. And so there's a lot of flexibility in this as well. The resources section is essentially a catch-all for the rest of the content of the audiobook. This would be things like the cover, the table of contents, any supplemental content that you might have in your audiobook, and as I'll get into in a little bit, things like transcripts. The resources section is really important because it lets you put all other content into the audiobook and have it related to the audiobook itself. This is really good for things like supplemental content, where today we often see if it is present in an audiobook, it's often delivered separately and often gets lost in the supply chain process. The publisher sends it, but not all retailers receive it. And so this provides retailers and reading systems and user agents with a method to know what it is, what its purpose is. The other really important thing I wanted to cover here is the table of contents. This is kind of a new concept for audiobooks. When we were discussing the specification and developing it, we wanted to provide a navigational method. This was something we took from EPUB and ebooks, and was like a big ask from users of audiobooks, especially for accessibility purposes. Knowing where you are in an audiobook or any book is really, really important for accessibility and just for general usability. So we provided a table of contents method. It is really simple. It is using HTML and is actually quite similar to the EPUB table of contents, but there is more details in the specification itself. We've also provided a method for packaging. You can package an audiobook up into a single file. We use a format called lightweight packaging format, or LPF. And this packaging format uses zip. If anyone is familiar with EPUB, this is quite similar, except that it is much simpler. There's quite a few less constraints. And the format was really designed to make it easier for audiobooks to move through that supply chain, just like all of this. The supply chain was a big driver for us, is just to simplify the process and make it easier for a book to travel from publisher to user. And this means that hopefully we can actually also divorce the audiobooks from the ecosystems that they are currently kind of locked into. A lot of audiobook retailers or reading apps make it quite difficult to download your audiobook, partially because, they want you to keep using their applications, but also because downloading audiobooks is kind of a challenge right now, because you often just end up with a list of MP3 files that may or may not have clear unifying metadata. So this is one of the reasons why we developed the packaging spec. The most important part, accessibility. The audiobooks specification was designed with accessibility in mind from the very beginning. We had a lot of help from a lot of amazing people, particularly Daisy. And making audiobooks is really simple with the manifest format, and making them accessible is even easier. It is as simple as adding an alternate to the reading order. I've provided an example here of an item in the reading order that has an alternate. And what we did in the specifications, we were really cognizant of the very different ways that people provide both files, so the type of media files that they provide, and also the different formats for accessibility. So we actually left the alternate open. We recommend there's 3 different ways. You can use a text transcript. This could be an HTML. You can use synchronized narration, which is an adjoining specification that's quite similar to Smile, but allows you to actually sync the audio and text of a document together to create kind of a read-along sort of experience. And we also provided a method for alternate formats, whatever that might look like. It's also about providing more than just a textual alternative to audio. As I mentioned before, things like the table of contents are really important for helping users to understand, where in the audiobook they are, not just that they are in an audiobook. the metadata is important for them to understand what they're listening to and, who is it by, how long is it, things like that. And so we wanted to make sure that every part of the audiobook specification was as flexible, but also as, open as possible so that anyone with any need could create the audiobooks for them. The future. It's pretty bright for audiobooks. As of yesterday, we formed the audiobooks working group. This was specifically built to maintain the audiobook standard because we know that there is still work to do. We are hoping in the coming months to see, implementation of the audiobook standard to, pick up more publishers, more retailers, more user agents picking up audiobooks and providing us feedback on things that we might need to change. We actually designed it to be a living standard, which means that we can more quickly and responsively do corrections or clarifications and even build out new features. We already have kind of a list of new features we are thinking about things like bitrate and high, low quality versions. And so you might see that coming down the pipe. But if anyone has any recommendations or any questions or even comments, we would love to hear them. And we are always available to talk. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for listening today and coming to this talk. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Wendy, thank you. That was super interesting. Congratulations on the new recommendations from myself and many participants in the chat. I have a few questions and we have some from the audience as well. You touched upon this, but I do want to hear you really say it. So you will audiobooks and ebooks eventually merge? You're saying it's not happening now. Now they're very different products with very different sort of legacy ecosystems as well. But do you think down the line that they could become largely the same thing?
I think in my personal dream world, maybe. But I do also recognize that they are very different experiences right now, and they probably are going to remain to be very different experiences just in the ecosystem. I also think I think probably people have touched on it already, there is a bit of a rights challenge when it comes to who holds ebook rights versus who holds audiobook rights and things like that. I would hope to see one day that the two formats kind of come together a little bit more and the rights problem gets solved by people understanding, the needs of users and what they want. But I definitely don't see it anytime soon, though I'm hopeful of for the future.
All right. You mentioned you mentioned this packaging specification in the context of these proprietary systems. Do you think that proprietary audiobook retailers would actually be willing to adopt a standard that it would make it eventually easier for me to break out of their ecosystem?
I know that some audiobook retailers already do it. And I know that some ebook retailers already do that for their ebooks. And so I don't think the barrier is too high. I definitely think it depends on the stance of the retailer or publisher on how they like their content distributed. So I'm hoping that by providing a simpler way for download to happen, it'll just become easier. Right now, I think it's just too difficult.
Yeah. Now, Alisa Zharkova from the Lithuanian Library for the Blind asked, what are the ways to convert already released simple audiobooks into W3C, into the new standard? And there is actually also, the chat is on fire, so people are giving each other tips about this, but what is your overall response to this?
Overall response is that it is incredibly easy. There is at least one tool out there already called Audio Packager. If you look for it if anyone is GitHub aware, there's a thing out there called Audio Packager. Essentially, if you put everything in a folder, it will actually just take that folder and turn it into a manifest or provide you a manifest. Otherwise, it is really as simple as just taking the existing list of files and plugging them into the reading order, and then, you already have the metadata as the publisher, so just filling in that metadata and making sure that it's a valid audiobook. If you've already got the files, you're already 90% of the way there.
So we've talked today on and off about synthetic speech. Do you think it will take over the human voice in audiobooks when the quality is good enough? And what kind of timeline are we talking about there? And also, I guess I wonder, is that more appropriate for certain types of books?
I'll answer the second question first. I definitely think it's more appropriate for certain types of books. I think it really depends on what the user wants. There is some. I read a really interesting book about audiobooks. It's called The History of the Talking Book. For anyone who wants to read it, I do recommend it. And there was an interesting section in there that was talking about how some people actually prefer a more mechanical way of speaking because it's faster to listen to. And so you can speed it up and get through the book really quickly, especially for maybe drier content like a textbook or science book or something like that. But I've also seen really interesting kind of radio play-esque audiobooks where they use multiple narrators and they use music and things like that. And so I don't think we'll ever fully see the human voice lost in audiobooks. I don't think synthetic voice will ever quite create that full experience. But for more, for easier production or for content that you just want to have a voice alternative for, I definitely think that synthetic voices are going to become much more common.
That is interesting. Because in a way I thought that maybe the distinction would be between sort of performance and reading. But of course, also as we've been reminded in some of the clips we've seen today, a lot of people who use a lot of audio listen to it sped up at an incredibly impressive pace for somebody who isn't used to that. And then it is much more the equivalent of making the voice in your own head, in fact. Instead, yeah, that's an interesting direction. Now let's see. Marianne from Denmark would like to know any news on a tool that can check audiobooks like the EPUB check.
Not yet, but I'm hoping that somebody kindly creates one. Right now, we're very much we're reliant on people to start implementing, and so we've had a lot of feedback and participation from some companies already that have already produced, and some people have just produced tools because they wanted to test something out or because they were working on something internally. And so I'm hoping that kind of happens with an audiobook checker, but we don't have any plans as of yet. But if anyone has any time or money to donate, happy to hear it.
I love it that we're getting into sort of these very philosophical questions again about these category distinctions. Martin Persson from MTM, here the Swedish authority says, thank you very much for your presentation. It seems conceptually the strict separation of audiobooks and ebooks is only reasonable if textual, as in digital text, constitutes the norm. Reflections, human narration might be more accurate to some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's. I think it's really gonna, in the end, especially as you said, as digital voices get better and our speech engines get stronger and more natural sounding. I think we still at this point have the kind of uncanny valley. You can tell when it's a computer speaking as opposed to a human. Once we get past that gap, I think it's really going to come down to an artistic choice between, does this book need multiple narrators, or does this book need music, or, it's going to be, and I kind of look forward to that actually, to people to put like kind of more art into the building of audiobooks when appropriate. And then when they don't need to, they can use these tools that are out there.
And I suppose that also then opens, again, other accessibility issues. Then you'd want the music to be optional, for instance, if it's on top of voice and so on. So, this is going to continue to develop. Thank you so much, Wendy, for taking the time to speak to us, especially during this incredibly exciting time for your organization. Thanks. There may be more questions. We'll get them to you in that case. Thanks for now.